Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Krista Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
Step right up, ladies and gentlemen. Come and hear the horrifying and shocking story of the prophet killer, John Linley Frazier, and the killings that would spark Santa Cruz, California, into being called the murder capital of the world. Today we begin a journey into a bizarre time and a bizarre place, a literal mystery spot, drenched in fog, where the ocean meets the redwoods and its blood-drenched history. Behold as we bring you Santa Cruz, murder capital of the world, Part 1, the story of John Linley Frazier, the prophet killer. And today's episode is a request from listener Richard Seskos. This one's for you, Richard. We hope you enjoy it.
And let's begin. Act 1. Vampires and the murder capital of the world. Santa Cruz, California, is a beach community on the northern edge of the Monterey Bay, approximately 70 miles south of San Francisco, known for its culture of surfing, skateboarding, and hippies, and made famous as the basis of the town Santa Carla in the vampire film Lost Boys, where it is described as the murder capital of the world. But far from that moniker being a fictional statement in a vampire film, in the 1970s, it was very, very true. At that moment in time, Santa Cruz, California was, in fact, the murder capital of the world.
Santa Cruz, Spanish for Holy Cross, was founded by the Spanish in 1791 when Fermin de Lasson established Mission Santa Cruz, and soon a settlement grew around the area that would be known far and wide as a place of absolute lawlessness and desperados. I think geographically, it's an ideal place for outlaws. Where the harbor is now would have been just a natural cove then. Boats could sneak in and sneak out of there, and it's flanked by massive cliffs. So it's fortified and easy to survey from, to watch who is coming and who is going. And then there's the redwood forest. Redwoods seem to attract outlaws. The shadows, so many places to hide. It's like a primordial jungle in a way. Hollowed out stumps everywhere, mounds of duff and bark. These massive ferns, gullies, hills, mountains, canyons, gulches, and tons of fresh water. Springs and tiny creeks everywhere. Perfect for hiding out. The terrain is rugged, difficult to navigate, easy to get lost in. Plus, there's all that fog. Outlaws love fog. And there's also a network of caves, all these different caves everywhere, which outlaws most likely hid in and would later be famous as a place to induct people into being vampires. They're just noodles, Michael. Just noodles.
Is that the right thing? It's just noodles? Isn't it rice?
Noodles.
Okay.
Isn't it noodles? Is it rice?
I thought it was rice.
I swear I thought it was noodles.
Let me look it up. Do you want me to look it up? Do you want to say both and then you can edit it?
No, I'm just going to leave this in. I think this is funny.
Okay. All right. In 1850, California became part of the United States of America, and in 1866, Santa Cruz was incorporated as a town, becoming a charter city in 1876.
During the 1860s, open bathhouses began opening along the beach, and tourists would come to the region to bathe in the saltwater ocean and the healing natural springs. And Santa Cruz became known as a resort town. and a tourist infrastructure of buildings began being built along the beach. Large open bathhouses, restaurants, a dance hall.
Also, you're totally right. It is noodles. I'm totally wrong. And in 1907, the iconic boardwalk and amusement park was established, the oldest amusement park in California, and forever immortalized in the movie Lost Boys.
And in 1911, they purchased a genuine loft carousel from merry-go-round manufacturer Charles Loft in Long Beach. Only 5 of these exist today. And do you know what the difference between a merry-go-round and a carousel is?
So I'm like confusing myself because I know in my town, in Watch Hill, we have the oldest hanging horse carousel, flying horses, they call it. But now I'm not sure if the carousel versus the merry-go-round, I don't think it's flying versus mounted, because the distinction in our town is that it's a flying horse carousel. So I think
Rhode Island always takes things to some spooky, weird level. So
true.
You gotta have them flying.
Yeah, right. So what is the difference between just a straight merry-go-round and a straight carousel?
A merry-go-round is slightly smaller and goes in a clockwise pattern. A carousel is larger and has 2 rows of horses. Merry-go-round only has 1 row and goes counterclockwise.
Okay, but now I'm weirded out even more because... No, you're right. Yeah, our carousel in Watch Hill goes counterclockwise and there's 2 rows. But in my head for a second, I was thinking it went clockwise. But yeah, our research king is correct. No shocker there. So yeah, cool.
The wonderful things you learn from Murder Coaster. Okay, here's some interesting tidbits when it comes to horrific amusement rides, which we here at Murder Coaster consider ourselves to be. So this guy, Ed Riker from Coney Island, he showed up in Santa Cruz in 1921, and he'd been working amusement parks since he was 15. Well, there was this bowling alley there, and he got the notion to turn that bowling alley into what they called a dark ride. And that's what they call them, the dark rides. Apparently this guy loved spooky, creepy shit and horror. So he somehow got the backing in 1932 to turn the bowling alley into Dante's Inferno, a trip to Hades. And you sat in a little cart and was pulled along a track through a maze in the darkness into the depths of hell, and devils and skeletons will be popping out at you. And a couple years later, he rethemed it Laughland and filled the thing with evil clowns. So ahead of his time. I love this guy. The ride eventually got bought up by the Seaside Company, who went pirate themed with it. But in 1973, it became the Haunted Castle, a legendary ride. And this place terrified children in the 80s. There was an executioner with a guillotine that would lob off a dummy's head. Crazy animatronics coming out of everywhere, hissing and growling. It's still there, but it's been completely refurbished. They dumped a ton of money into it, but they also tried to make it less horrifying and terrifying and more family-friendly, but it's still a lot of fun.
After World War II, Santa Cruz was one of those seaside resort towns that was bustling in the summer when tourists flocked to the boardwalk, but dead in the winter. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, most of the population was elderly and retired, and Santa Cruz was known as a very conservative place.
While the tumult of the 1960s began to rage through California, Santa Cruz remained a quiet and still fairly conservative seaside town, most famous for surfing. Surf Magazine hailed it as Surf Town, USA. But the counterculture did leak down. One local resident describes having a coffee with a fellow, only to realize he was beatnik legend Neil Cassidy, then running to the bookstore to buy a copy of On the Road for him to sign. Later, the same guy was having coffee with an older gentleman and his son, and realized it was actually Henry Miller, again running to the bookstore to buy books for him to sign.
But the biggest change to the sleepy little surf and resort town of retirees came in 1965, when the University of California, Santa Cruz opened. UC Santa Cruz was conceived as an experimental college, and the new university would become a bastion of liberal thinking and hippie culture, and be described as the most significant educational experiment in the history of the University of California. The campus's first director of academic planning would coin the phrase, quote, orderly disorder, end quote, to clarify the tone and objectives of the campus.
The new university immediately had a reputation as a place of tolerance and catered to the different and weird. Academic freaks and freethinkers of all sorts. The older conservative residents who had dominated Santa Cruz for so long were upset that the college, which was supposed to bring clean-cut students and a football team, was instead bringing in long-haired pot smokers and anti-war draft dodgers. Hippies began to migrate from all over the world, drawn to the magic of the redwood trees, the freedom of the rugged hills, the beauty of the Pacific Ocean. And in the redwood-covered hills outside the city, communes were popping up, folks living in teepees, practicing free love and growing weed.
And then the Consumers Co-op of Santa Cruz, run by hippies from the university, opened a coffee shop and restaurant and musical performance space called The Catalyst.
The Catalyst was to be a literal catalyst between the hippie university crowd and the town of Santa Cruz itself, and it became a beacon of the counterculture. In the 60s, it was located where the bookstore is now, which was the St. George Hotel before that. But in the 70s, it moved down the street to where it is today, putting on crazy music shows and serving pizza by the slice. I just fucking love Santa Cruz. You used to live in Los Angeles, right? Did you ever get up to Santa Cruz?
I did not get up there, no. And I also don't think, no, I know that I had not seen Lost Boys when I was living in LA. And now that I've seen it, and now I wish I had gotten there, but I never did.
Well, it's always there. It's always there waiting for you.
It's true.
You can do the whole Lost Boys experience. You know, that comic book store is there. And
Oh, that's
they
rad.
it's a lot of fun.
I know that movie is awesome and everyone's kind of a fan of it, but I'm a super big fan of it. It's really, I waited a long time to see it. And once I saw it, I was like, why did I wait? This movie's fantastic.
I went in the comic book store. I'm like, do you have Batman number 14? And they're like, oh, Lost Boys fan. And they had props from the movie, do you remember the vampire comic book prop that they show them? They had that there all framed. They brought it out for me and let me take a selfie with it and stuff. Yeah.
That's awesome.
And there's just something about that place. It's really kind of gothic, dark shadows. Because there's those majestic cliffs and the oceans crashing against them, fog rolling down, the ancient redwood groves.
Oh, love it.
A darkness has fallen over Collinwood.
Great. So, as the counterculture of the 60s raged through California, often leaving scorched earth behind in places like Berkeley with riots and protests, and Altamont, where a free concert for the Rolling Stones saw the Hells Angels stab a man to death on camera, and Cielo Drive, Los Angeles, where the Manson family butchered a pregnant movie star, Santa Cruz still remained a quiet, charming place of redwood forests and pristine beaches, of more or less acceptance and understanding. But that would all come crashing down on October 19th, 1970, when smoke was seen billowing up from the Redwood Hills to the south of Santa Cruz.
Chapter 1: The Otis. The mansion of beloved eye surgeon Victor Ota was on fire. Victor Ota was a portrait of the American dream. Born in Montana to Japanese immigrants, he enlisted in the Army in 1943 and served until 1945, and then went to medical school in Chicago on the GI Bill, graduating at the top of his class in 1950. He fell in love with and married a beautiful woman named Virginia Tobias, whose parents were also immigrants, but from Czechoslovakia, and the couple had 4 children.
Victor re-enlisted in the Air Force and became a military surgeon, dedicating himself to the study of eyes, literally trying to help people see. After his stint in the Air Force, he moved his family to Santa Cruz in late 1959, practically penniless. The whole family piled into a Volkswagen van with their meager possessions for the long drive to California.
Because Santa Cruz was known as a retirement village, there were many older people with bad eyes, and Victor was quickly able to establish a thriving practice as an eye surgeon, developing a reputation as both a skilled and knowledgeable doctor.
Victor was known as a kind and compassionate man who never said an angry word. He was generous, outgoing, and friendly. He partnered up with an ear, nose, and throat surgeon, and they built a large medical office complex. As he became more successful, he brought his Japanese parents from Montana and bought them a little house right above his office.
Victor's practice thrived, and he was quickly able to accumulate large amounts of wealth, building a mansion in the redwoods overlooking the Monterey Bay. But Victor and Virginia were both great lovers of nature and built the house with architect Aaron Green, a protege of Frank Lloyd Wright, working so that no trees would be destroyed. In fact, the large covered deck was built around a towering redwood tree, incorporating it into the structure of the house and using Japanese elements of design that mimicked nature.
Virginia actually weaved the bedspreads and pillowcases herself on a huge loom.
The family was a portrait of American success and happiness, and well known and beloved to the community, when firefighters came racing out to their home to put out the blaze. The first odd thing they found was that Victor's Rolls Royce was parked sideways at the bottom of the driveway, blocking their ascent to the house.
A fire hydrant had been installed at the property, which was supplied with water from the house's swimming pool. So Fire Chief Ted Pound quickly went to the back of the house to see where the pipe came through into the pool. Shining his flashlight into the dark water of the swimming pool, a ghastly sight was illuminated. The face of a dead child staring up at him from the dark depths of the water.
At first, he thought it was a mannequin. But as all true crime podcast listeners know, it's never a mannequin.
Gasping in horror, he then saw another body floating on top of the water, and casting his flashlight beam, he was able to make out 5 bodies in all.
Virginia Ota lay on the bottom of the pool, face up, eyes open, her blonde hair floating about her head, hands and feet bound. Victor lay beside her, face down. Their son Taggart lay nearby, a long streak of blood streaming from his head. Their other son Derek lay alone at the other end of the pool, his face covered by scarves tied around his neck. And Victor's assistant, Mrs. Codwaller, still in her white medical office uniform, floated along on the surface.
As the blaze was extinguished by the fire department, a light rain began to fall. Police had no weapon, no suspect, no motive. What could have happened here?
But when police went to the Rolls Royce blocking the driveway, they discovered an incredibly odd something. The key had been broken off in the ignition, and on the windshield was a letter that would later be determined to have been typed on Victor's own typewriter by the killer. The bizarre letter read,
Halloween 1970. Today, World War III will begin as brought to you by the people of the free universe. From this day forward, anyone and or everyone or company of persons who misuses the natural environment or destroys same will suffer the penalty of death by the people of the free universe. I and my comrades from this day forth will fight until death or freedom against anyone who does not support natural life on this planet. Materialism must die, or mankind will stop. Knight of Wands, Knight of Cups, Knight of Pentacles, Knight of Swords.
Immediately, the community went into a panic, thinking it must be drug-addled hippies.
And the Manson family murder spree had occurred just a year earlier, 300 miles south in Los Angeles, and was still on everyone's minds.
Law enforcement held a news conference the next day and made no secret that it was hippies who were believed to be behind the crime, saying the transient elements would be thoroughly sought out.
But while the community became divided by long hairs and straights and fear of the flower children abounded, it would be the hippie community themselves who would turn over the killer, saying that while he espoused some of their ideals and wanted to be a part of their movement, they wanted nothing to do with him, and he did not reflect on them, that he disgusted them.
The man they named was a 24-year-old auto mechanic living in a shack on his mother's property, just a mile from Victor Oda's palatial home. And that man's name was John Linley Frazier.
Chapter 2, Little Johnny. John Linley Frazier was born in Carrizozo, New Mexico on January 26, 1946. He was 1 month premature and spent 2 weeks in an incubator. But despite this, he was both walking and talking by 11 months old. His father was in the Air Force, so the family moved around quite a bit. But John's father was a drunk who'd often forget where he lived and would frequent shady bars where he'd hook up with disreputable women. And John's mother, Pat, left him in 1948, finding work as a nurse to support her and her young son.
As a small child, John had some significant health issues. After becoming very ill, he was brought to the hospital where he was diagnosed with double pneumonia, which settled in his stomach, at which point his appendix ruptured. He had to get operated on to remove an obstruction. And while he was recovering from all of this, which is a lot, he was exposed to measles by a nurse and had to remain in the hospital much longer.
After this, his mother says he was a sickly child with a compromised immune system and had a chronic cold, and then developed tuberculosis.
His mother then moved to San Francisco to attend dental college. In 1952, when he was just 8 years old, John was in an automobile accident that left him with a severe concussion and a broken collarbone, and he actually went blind for several weeks. This kid has had a tough go at it, man. His mother says he was also a constant bedwetter and a sleepwalker. He'd just wander around the house at night, and she'd have to yell at him to go back to bed, which he would do, all zombie-like.
His mother, Pat, had to work her way through dental college, so she'd work from 7 at night until 3 in the morning, then go to school all day. So she kept John with a foster family who were strict Catholics and would beat him for any transgression.
He was described as a sullen, unhappy child. And on June 1st, 1956, at just 10 years old, John was arrested in San Francisco for stealing a knife from a store. But the charge was dismissed in juvenile court.
His mother married and moved from the Bay Area down to Santa Cruz, where 2 years later, Johnny was arrested for vandalizing a tile factory. Again, the charges were dropped.
Johnny became a full-on juvenile delinquent, skipping school, getting into fights. He once poured kerosene on a cat and lit it on fire. He quit school at 15, a freshman at Santa Cruz High. He ran away, got picked up, and in July of 1961 was placed in a juvenile hall and then placed with foster parents in Watsonville, a farming community just outside of Santa Cruz. There, he stole a pistol from the family and ran away. But he was caught and sent to Camp Owen in Kernville. He claims he stole the pistol because he planned to live in the forest and survive off of hunting small game. As we'll see, he's obsessed with the forest.
When asked by a juvenile court psychiatrist what he liked about his mother, he replied,
I don't particularly like anything about her.
but he did express a liking for his stepfather.
He went to trade school learning to become a mechanic, but was still getting into constant trouble, supposedly fathering an illegitimate child with a girl in Southern California while still a teenager. He was a full-on greaser by this point, hair slicked back, working on cars, and loved smoking big cigars.
He eventually made his way back to Santa Cruz, where he worked as a service station attendant and auto mechanic for a gas station in the Rancho Del Mar shopping center called Disco Auto.
You know, at first I thought this was some kind of disco-themed mechanic and was like, dude, that is too cool. But then I realized that there was this whole line of stores in the area at the time called Disco, like the Disco Market. And they're not named after funky music and cool dance moves. It's just short for discount, not the French word discothèque, which means a library of music.
Yeah, definitely disappointing. His mother, meanwhile, had started a commercial rabbit ranch and worm farm called Bunny Haven, becoming known as a, quote, sort of one-woman press agent for rabbit raising, end quote.
She'd later note that John was not capable of even killing a rabbit for market, saying,
He was always kind to animals, and he couldn't stand abuse of life.
which goes completely contrary to both him saying he stole a pistol to hunt small game and the story his friends tell of him setting a cat on fire. Now, I just think he was lazy. Butchering rabbits is hard work. He also hated his mother with a deep passion, so he probably didn't want to help on her farm in any way.
He did like karate, though, and took lessons.
It seems like back then everybody was kung fu fighting. I tell you, those cats were fast as lightning.
He also enjoyed sneaking into campgrounds in the middle of the night and putting firecrackers by the coals of the fires so they'd eventually pop off and wake up all the sleeping campers, which is pretty freaky if you think about it. You're camping in the woods, and this guy is sneaking around your tent up to no good.
But he was an avid lover of the forest and would hike the trails and learn the country, knew how to get from place to place, slinking through the redwoods and oaks and firs.
In 1966, while he was working at Disco Auto, he met a lady named Dolores working at the snack bar at Disco Market. I sure wish they were all dancing and wearing funky clothes, but I guess we're still 10 years too early for that.
Dolores was married with a daughter, but evidently the sparks flew. She says that he was, quote,
Passionate, really silent, not moody, but instead of making passes at me like people do to the girl at a snack bar, Johnny would look at me and we'd communicate more through our eyes. And I really dug him. When we touched, that's all there was to it. And there was never anybody else. It was like a shock reaction. It was just beautiful.
"Aw, isn't that cute? It was just beautiful. Never mind that he set cats on fire and would soon murder an entire family, including two young children."
Dolores told her husband she was in love with another man and wanted a divorce. But instead of giving in, her husband just up and moved the entire family to Washington. Problem solved.
But the young lover, John Linley Frazier, was undaunted and drove all the way up to Washington and took his true love back to California, leaving her daughter behind. Oh, well, that's just the way of love. She romantically says this about the time, quote,
We had a beautiful time. He had nightmares a lot. He would get horribly sweaty and cold, and he'd yell and whimper and cry, and he wet the bed quite a few times. But he calmed down after we'd been together about 2 months.
Okay. Sounds beautiful. Yeah, yeah. She goes on to say, quote,
He did have one strange nightmare once. He got up in the middle of the night and he was still sleeping. He was stumbling and cursing. He kept saying, "Where is it?" He went to the dresser and started fumbling, and I was kind of worried because that's where his gun was, and it was loaded. He was really violent, shaking the dresser, trying to get the drawer open.
yeah, yeah. Red flag. I'm no doctor, but I don't know. I feel like sleepwalking, trying to find a gun that's loaded, maybe a sign that, I don't know, your brain is unable to separate the dream state from reality. It's not good.
She said he stopped wetting the bed for about 2 months, but that after a stressful period where they had to go to Washington for her divorce, he began wetting the bed again, and she didn't mind washing the sheets. Just true love, I guess.
At that time, and Ed Kemper would later say the same thing. Oh, don't worry, we're going to get to him. Well, there was little work in the winter in Santa Cruz. The tourist industry was the main source of revenue for the city, and it was all shut down in the winter. Johnny couldn't find steady work and fell into a deep depression.
Dolores found a job in Watsonville at the Green Giant Cannery and supported the two of them.
And it was this swinging 60s, and they were in California. So old Johnny went from a greaser to a hippie. He started hanging out at the Catalyst, seeing crazy acid rock bands and dropping LSD, growing his greasy hair out, sprouting a beard, putting on some love beads.
And then he started acting weird. But I mean, come on, this guy's been weird his whole life.
Yeah, I think his brain might have been damaged by fever during all those health crises as a child to begin with, and then the car wreck that made him go blind for a week. And now he's eating all this acid. Psychedelics can be a good thing for some people, but they can definitely be dangerous for people with pre existing mental health issues, especially schizophrenia. It can make it much worse.
Well, Johnny started saying that auto mechanics wouldn't be needed much longer because cars were going to become obsolete. So he wanted to study to be an airplane mechanic. Then he decided to start a dating service in Santa Cruz.
Which is actually could have worked, you know.
He worked for a garage called Putney and Perry's for a while, but would get in huge fights with his boss, so intense they'd make him throw up.
Can you imagine throwing up while fighting with your boss? You know, this is a tragic story, but honestly, a lot of it is really fucking funny. I can't help it. I can just see this little hippie guy screaming at his boss, get so excited. He just like and throw up. But he was doing some really scary shit as well. He would follow women, walking right behind them, whispering curses and spitting at them. And he was actually taken in for questioning about this, but he denied it was him. And he just started walking into people's houses. Acquaintances would say he'd just appear in a room unannounced. They'd look over and he'd just be standing there with his hands in his pocket. And that is some seriously creepy shit there.
And Dolores did not like these strange changes. In the parlance of the 60s, Dolores says, quote, "We were losing our rapture together fast, man."
He became incredibly tense and demanding, fighting with Dolores when she started studying health foods and organic gardening at the Free University, which is some really OG hippie shit there. Studying health food and organic gardening at the Free University, man.
Some of Dolores's friends from Washington came on down and moved in with them, Allison and June, which created a lot of tension in the household.
Then came the accident. Nothing was ever the same again after the accident. It's just such a classic line right there, man. It sounds like a Audrey Hepburn movie or something, but
Yeah,
it's true.
totally. Johnny got into an accident, but he rear-ended another car, going pretty fast.
And when you rear end a car, it is completely your fault, by the way. You should not be that close to another car. Don't tailgate.
He suffered a severe blow to the head. Dolores said he had a big old knot, but police at the scene said he looked fine. He wasn't hurt. He was acting normal, didn't seem intoxicated. Just an idiot.
Well, he loved this car and he was fastidious about it. You'd think he'd be devastated, but he just went home and acted like everything was completely normal. He wasn't upset or angry, very calm. And it was after that night that the voices in his head started.
And the voices told him that he should never drive again, that driving was evil and wrong. He quit his newest job as a mechanic, saying he'd never work on a car again, telling his boss, quote,
God wants us to return the earth to its original condition.
he'd tell anyone who'd listen that
Materialistic people are going to finally come down. Something's got to be done to keep them from destroying the earth by subdivisions and blacktop, man.
he began telling people that he was born in India hundreds of years ago and was sent to the earth to save it from destruction. He said he was a great teacher, and everyone needed to study under him in the ways in which to treat the earth.
He planned out this big revealing ceremony with music and a speech for Dolores, June, and Allison, but he kept mixing up his words, saying thou instead of thee, losing his train of thought. And he had the music set up on the stereo to accompany him, but it kept starting on the wrong song and he couldn't find the right track on the record. Remember, everything's records back then. And eventually he became so flustered that he fell to his knees and started going, "Forgive me, God, forgive me."
He also started wearing pink sunglasses and saying he needed them to keep the devil out of his eyes. I think that's what I'm going to say. I typically have sunglasses on my face in the summer because they're prescription. So I like walk into the bank with them on and then I like apologize for having my sunglasses on. I think I'm just going to start using that. I need these to keep the devil out of my eyes.
Never apologize for wearing sunglasses indoors.
Okay, fair enough. Or that.
I think it's a quote from Bob Dylan.
Oh, makes sense.
Then he began to preach that a house, any house, was the devil's temple.
People say he started trying to act like an old school prophet with the rough-hewn outdoorsman and hermit qualities of John the Baptist and the insanity and fiery spirit of John the Revelator. He was the embodiment of it all, and he'd lay it on thick. He became a burly mountain man in a fringed leather jacket, a buckskin hat, and knee-high moccasins, carrying a huge Bowie knife strapped to his side.
And he was eating mescaline by the handful. They must have had some kind of connect. Mescaline is like just chemically concentrated peyote buttons. If you remember, the first Manson family victim, Gary Hinman, used to make this stuff, which supposedly was the crucible that started that whole mess. And they'd all be high as kites on mescaline, and he'd be preaching. Dolores's friend Allison describes it like this.
He kept saying he loved us and he reached out and held both my hands and like the energy from him was really strong. It was like he was hypnotizing me. I didn't know what was happening. The words he was using were becoming more violent and aggressive, and he kept putting out more and more uptight vibrations.
Uptight vibrations. That's not groovy, man. That's a total bum trip.
And then he dramatically wrote all their names out on a piece of paper, then erased them and said they didn't exist anymore.
Yeah, that will freak someone on acid right the fuck out. It's like the hitchhiker in the beginning of Texas Chainsaw Massacre when he sets their Polaroid on fire.
And then he said their names belonged only to him.
And check this shit out. There was a demon mask on the wall, and everyone there said the demon mask was glowing. It's kind of like, no, it definitely is some crazy horror story. Where's Ed and Lorraine Warren when you need them?
Uh, and they freaked out so badly, they grabbed the demon mask and threw it outside.
I've actually had acid trips like that. That's why I stopped eating the stuff. He began talking about the Bible nonstop, especially about John of Patmos, now saying he was the reincarnated spirits of the mad prophet and feverishly rewriting the book of Revelations. David Koresh was pretty much doing the same thing, interestingly. And it's simply crazy how many people we've covered who went off the deep end reading that section of the New Testament, from Charlie Manson to Lori Vallow. We should do a show just on the book of Revelations and all the theories, comparing and contrasting them. There's some great stuff in there. The great dragon Satan bursting from the sea with 7 heads to give the mark of the beast to those made drunk by the wine of the whore of Babylon. But, maybe don't read that high on acid. Always seems to lead to bad places.
Noted. Fair enough. Johnny also now claimed he could talk to animals and would sit talking to squirrels and lizards for hours, but grow furious when they wouldn't talk back, which is like totally hilarious. Come on.
Why won't you talk to me? Disturbingly, he tried to bring a dead sheep back to life, then flew into a rage when it wouldn't talk to him and stomped up and down on it. Serious red fucking flag there. And, check this out. The group did, in fact, call a minister for help.
Yes, when Johnny got just too hot to handle, they called a minister. It's old days, I guess. Instead of an educated, validated, and certified mental health technician, you call the local preacher down the street.
And when the preacher showed up, Johnny started screaming, "The Bible is lies! The Bible is lies!" And grabbed a stool and started smashing it against the wall, tearing the house apart. Can you imagine if Ed and Lorraine Warren were there when that happened? They would just be so happy. They would have been thrilled.
Absolutely. And now they're really freaked out, so they call Johnny's mother, who does a smart thing. She calls an ambulance and says he's having a medical emergency, which technically he absolutely was. He was, obviously in a psychotic state, probably from minor brain damage as a child and psychosis brought on by recent traumatic head injury, and copious amounts of psychedelic drugs.
Yeah, he's really got the full spectrum of issues going on here. And it's very much believed that he was also schizophrenic as well.
But when Johnny hears the sirens approaching, he takes off into the forest. Remember, he loves the woods.
He climbed atop a huge abandoned wooden water tower deep in the woods. And you see these things a lot out there. They're really cool, just like this big, tall wooden platform with a redwood water tank perched above it. The height of the water tank, makes the water pressure, and they can use it for agriculture and stuff. It's like something out of East of Eden by John Steinbeck. Same general area, actually, just north a ways.
Once on the top, Johnny would pull the ladder up so no one could get to him. He lived up there for long periods, reading the Bible, growing more and more paranoid and delusional.
Meanwhile, back in the normal world, his mother was doing pretty well for herself. She was a very focused and driven, independent 60s woman. And she was now the rabbit lady of Santa Cruz. She's got all this organic fertilizer for sale, a worm farm, chicken coops, egg production. So she gets herself a nice piece of property out in the redwoods south of town. It's like a little farm, bunch of acreage. There's a couple rental units and a trailer.
On the far edge of the property, there's a little rope bridge that goes over a gully and leads to a structure they call the milk shack, which had once been an old hay barn and milking station.
So Johnny moves into the milk shack. He hooks electricity up to the place, puts in a stereo, plays records. I'm going to imagine the Doors and Jimi Hendrix. And he smokes weed and eats mescaline, reading the Bible. preaching to anyone who happened to come by how capitalism is destroying the world and that everyone should just live in the forest.
And from the milk shack, peering out into the distance across the valley, he could see the mansion of beloved eye surgeon and town icon Victor Ota. He'd peer at this mansion through binoculars for hours, studying it.
The mansion became a symbol of the destruction of the forest and the earth by man, the ultimate representation of man's indifference to the ways of nature.
But in actuality, the good doctor and his wife loved the forest and had worked with a famous architect to ensure the house was environmentally built with no harm to the forest and had actually incorporated trees into the structure. It was a celebrated house, a loved house, built into a lush open meadow, and he entertained often, even let friends hold their weddings on the property, actor Jack Lemmon coming to one of the weddings.
And the Otas loved Halloween, had huge parties celebrating the holiday, Victor carving dozens of pumpkins himself. And lovers of Halloween are notoriously good people.
And because Halloween was getting closer, they had a lot of traffic coming and going, preparing for the grand festivities. And Johnny watched that traffic through the cracks in his little shack, growing irate with psychotic, misplaced anger and self-righteousness.
Johnny would sometimes harass and taunt them, go over and knock on their door, ask the doctor weird questions and freak everyone out. One time they caught him at the back door, staring inside.
Johnny began breaking into the place when no one was home, sometimes letting the dogs out. He broke into other houses too, like their neighbor Donald Mooney. He'd stolen 6 guns from there, including a .38 Smith & Wesson revolver and a .22 Ruger pistol that he carried around with him, bragging about it to his hippie friends who didn't think it was cool at all. At this point, everyone was pretty wary, scared, and tired of this guy. He then began camping out in the woods near the Ota's house.
He reminds me of that boy who lived in the walls case we did, Daniel LaPlante.
Yes.
Terrifying.
One day, totally. One day, Johnny showed up at his friend Roger Crone's house and said to him, quote,
"The revolution has started, man. Either you're part of the solution or you're part of the problem, Jack. I'll be back to give you a choice." I imagine him talking like Charlie Manson. I'm just like falling into it.
Yeah, I think that totally tracks based on what we know of this. He showed up at his hippie friend's house and pulled out the .38, saying he needed to snuff out the materialists, acting too cool for school.
And interestingly, he kept calling them rednecks. He kept saying they're rednecks. But I think this guy's not a redneck. He's a successful eye surgeon. He literally helps people see. I don't know what he thought a redneck is. A redneck means you work outside so much your neck is red.
Right. Bizarre. He somehow got his hands on a book about tarot cards and began bugging out on the knights, which to him represented warriors and avengers, cards of violence and wrath, bringing righteous judgment. But to be clear, it appears he didn't even own a set of tarot cards and had just come across this book.
Yeah, I would think the Tower card. Then maybe the Knight of Swords. Because, the Knight of Cups is often seen as good news. It's like people say it's like falling in love and shit. But anyway, it's all open to interpretation. I think if you're a violent person and you play with tarot cards, you'll see violence. And if you're a peaceful person, all the cards are more or less pretty peaceful.
Yeah, I think that's solid. And Johnny began telling everyone he was heading east like a free spirit, a wandering preacher and prophet. He gave away all of his possessions besides a backpack, held his head to 4 winds, and wandered forth into the forest.
He said he was going to hitchhike off and live free, man. Like the lilies of the field, brother. How they grow, yet they neither toil nor spin. He heard New York had a groove, he seen. Maybe he'd hang out there in the forest upstate, wherever the wind blew him. He gulped down some of the orange mescaline powder he kept in a tin, grabbed a bottle of wine, then set off into the forest, leaving materialism behind.
Chapter 3: The Killer Prophet. Johnny hiked into the morning sunrise, umber beams of light breaking through the massive trees. Trekking south through the hills to his left, the Monterey Bay spilled out far below. The soulful and lonely hooting of a red-throated loon sounded in the distance as he crept through the tall ferns and spotted groves of oak and madrone. Johnny hadn't told anyone this yet, but he had a plan. A bold, beautiful plan he was going to use to set in motion to save the world. This plan would be like a domino effect that couldn't fail. He would travel the world, breaking into houses and taking the males, and it had to be a man. Did we mention he's also completely sexist? And say to them, quote,
"I'm here on God's behalf, and you have to make a decision. You have to decide whether or not you are going to join God's army. You and your family will destroy all your belongings and go with me to your neighbor's house and give them the same choice. And you choose death or you choose to join God's army."
And he'd already started his plan, starting with the Muni's. They were the ultimate representation of the whore of Babylon. Mr. Muni's worked for the government. He'd sat waiting in the Muni house for what seemed like days, waiting for them to arrive so he could put his plan into action. Only they'd never come home. He waited and waited and waited, reading their magazines, rifling through all their belongings, taking an orange backpack, some hiking equipment, a whole mess of guns. But they'd never showed up, so he'd taken off. This time he was headed to the Ota house. It was there the revolution would begin.
Around noon, he came creeping out of the forest. The .38 revolver and .22 pistol he'd stolen from the Mooney house tucked into his waistband, and up to the Ota house, which by now he knew like the back of his hand, having studied it for months and already broken into it before. The dogs even knew him and thought nothing of him coming in.
The house is empty. Mrs. Ota is at the Santa Cruz travel agency, confirming the family's plans to go to Hawaii for Thanksgiving. Johnny creeps about, moving on the balls of his feet, cutting the phone lines with his Bowie knife, sneering at their opulence, all their fancy, glossy magazines. So bourgeois, and is disgusted to see a bearskin bedspread on the bed.
He'd later harp on and on about this bearskin bedspread, say that it really blew his mind, man. An actual quote. What I think he was saying by blew his mind was that the bearskin was the ultimate representation of man destroying nature and the inherent decadence of materialism.
But guess what? It was fake. Dr. Ota was a total environmentalist. His house was dedicated to principles of ecology and Japanese design. I mean, there was a fucking redwood tree growing through the covered deck. The swimming pool wasn't just for swimming. It was offered up free for the community to use to extinguish fire. This guy was just too dumb to see all the ways this family was trying to live at one with nature.
There's just so many paradoxes at work in this story, and it's just so sad.
Then Virginia Ota came home. Johnny took her by surprise, bound her and blindfolded her using silk scarves. Mr. Ota loved colorful silk scarves. Remember, this is 1970, total silk scarf time. And Johnny would use these colorful scarves to bind everyone.
Virginia was terrified that he would rape her, but Johnny explained to her that he was just there to save the world and actually made her a drink to calm her down. She then told him that people would become suspicious if she didn't pick up her son from school. Her oldest child, Tara, was in New York, a freshman in college, and her second oldest, Lark, was at boarding school in Monterey. Only the two youngest boys were living at home.
So Johnny called Dr. Ota's office and told the receptionist he was a mechanic at Union Garage and Mrs. Ota's car is broken down and her kids would need to be picked up.
So Dr. Ota's assistant, Mrs. Codwalder, went and picked up Taggart from school and drove him home.
Dr. Ota went and picked up the youngest boy, Derek, himself, and they went to his mother's house so the little boy could eat noodles with his grandmother.
That is just a tearjerker there.
Mrs. Cadwallader arrived at the house with Taggart, and Johnny took them both prisoner, binding them with colorful silk scarves and placing each of them in separate parts of the house.
Then Dr. Ota, the man of the house, arrived with Derek. And now it was go time. Time for the revolution to start. All Johnny had to do was convince esteemed eye surgeon Dr. Victor Ota to join him in his crusade and show his commitment by burning down his house. Only, as you may suspect, it didn't go as planned.
After tying up Derek, Johnny took Dr. Vincent Ota out back to his swimming pool, cursing at him the entire time for being a forest-destroying materialist capitalist responsible for the destruction of the Santa Cruz mountains, even though, in actuality, the house had been built to be part of the mountains, and ignoring the fact that his mother had a literal worm farm a mile down the road with rental units and trailers on it.
Dr. Ota tells Johnny he is a drugged out hippie, which, technically is very true. And he demands that this drugged out hippie leave his house at that moment, asking where his wife and children were.
Johnny then explains to Dr. Ota that they need to return this place to nature, and that Dr. Ota and he needed to join forces and burn the house down together and let the forest heal from this trespass, and that if he does this, he'll let his family go free.
This really pisses Dr. Ota off. No way he was setting his house on fire for this drugged out hippie weirdo. This was his dream home. He designed it himself with the help of a world-acclaimed architect, supervised the construction. His wife had sewn the curtains and actually weaved the very sheets herself. There was no way in hell he was burning it down. Not to mention, a fire would be terrible for the environment. It would kill the trees.
Dr. Ota then tells him he'll give him all the money he wants if he just leaves. He'll pay any price. This really pisses off Johnny, who'd given away all his money before starting his sacred mission as a token of purity. Money is the last thing he wanted. What would it take this materialistic person to see what was of spiritual importance?
Johnny, growing flustered, then shoved Dr. Ota into the pool, probably while saying something ridiculous like, "You need to cool off, man."
Johnny then reached his hand out to Dr. Ota, offering to pull him up from the water and asking him to join him on his sacred mission. In a scene like an action movie that would have been really cool if it had worked, Dr. Ota grabbed Johnny's hand and tried to pull him into the water, taking a swipe at him at the same time.
Johnny managed to slip free, jumped back, and began firing the .38, hitting him twice. And Dr. Victor Ota, acclaimed surgeon and beloved doctor, devoted father and husband, environmentalist, philanthropist, sank face first to the bottom of the pool, slipping into shadow and darkness, one of the scarves he loved so much, swaying upwards like a colorful and wounded bird.
Johnny then went to the bedroom and got Mrs. Ota, who somehow hadn't heard the shots of the loud .38. The neighbors, too, would say that they never heard a single gunshot or any commotion. He led her down to the pool, hands bound before her, the .22 pointed at the back of her head. He asked her if she believed in God. She said she did, and he told her,
"Then you have nothing to be afraid of."
And he squeezed the trigger of the pistol, the bullet going into her skull, bouncing about her brain before he shoved her into the water, where she slowly turned 180 degrees, facing upward now. That beautiful face that her children would stare at in awe, Mesmerized by her grace and elegance, now stricken in a look of anguished surprise as she floated to the bottom of the pool to lay beside her husband, her blonde hair fluttering upward.
He then brought Mrs. Cadwallader down, still in her white medical uniform, asking her too if she believed in God, telling her she had nothing to be afraid of when she confirmed she did, then putting a bullet in her head and shoving her into the water where she'd splash face first, floating on the top as if not to sink down and disturb the doctor and his wife in their deathly slumber on the bottom, slowly drifting off to the far end as Johnny went up and brought down 12-year-old Taggart.
John Linley Frazier asked the boy, "Do you believe in God?" And he answered, "I don't know. I'm not sure."
This bit of honesty, in the midst of so much delusion and psychosis, irritated Johnny. So he made a snide remark about the kid's fancy clothes, shot him in the head, and shoved him in the pool, where he floated to the bottom to join his mother and father.
Then he brought out little Derek, the youngest child, just 11 years old, who only hours earlier had been happily eating noodles with his grandmother while his father planned the family's annual Halloween party. Johnny's plan had always been to release the youngest members of families. They were the most innocent and pure, the new generation who would carry on with the revolution.
But when he asked the youngster if he'd seen his face, the boy faltered, saying, "Yes, I mean no." So he shot him too in the head and dumped him in the pool, where he lay there, sad, wide eyes, staring upwards into the watery darkness, waiting patiently for the flashlight beam of a fireman to expose the terrible, terrible story.
Johnny went to the doctor's office and on a typewriter pecked out his idiotic hippie manifesto.
Why did he say it was Halloween? Was it a delusion? Stupidity? I think the house was just full of Halloween decorations, pumpkins everywhere. The doctor was known to carve dozens of jack-o'-lanterns himself, which probably looked so cool all lit up in a pile. You know, Halloween was their favorite holiday, the big one. Or maybe Johnny meant Halloween would be the day that the next attack would occur and the revolution would really kick off. You know, who knows? And why those tarot cards? There's no indication that he even owned a set of tarot cards. He just had that book and had been reading it. Probably just another obsession in his deep psychosis. But he had been claiming he was part of a larger organization, and he was in a gang of 3 others, each represented by the knight card of a particular suit. Was this to make himself sound more important? Or maybe throw a red herring at the police? Did he actually believe it in his delusional state? Or was it true? Okay, I think he worked alone. He was just a lone nut. But there are conspiracy theorists out there who think he may have actually had accomplices. And you know, people tie this guy to everyone from the Manson family to the Zodiac killer, sometimes offering kind of interesting evidence. It's a rabbit hole. I really think he was obviously alone.
Johnny then got into the doctor's Rolls Royce, pulled it up at a 90-degree angle so it blocked the driveway to the house, hoping to keep firefighters back, broke the key off in the ignition, and put his stupid manifesto on the windshield under the windshield wiper, like some kind of parking ticket or something.
He then went into the kitchen and started a number of small fires, and then left in Mrs. Oda's Oldsmobile station wagon, the Vista Cruiser model, which was the really stylish one. She had always been known for being incredibly stylish.
The next day, he was spotted driving the station wagon about erratically several times, swerving off the road, almost crashing. He'd sworn he'd never drive again, but there he is, driving this super stylish soccer mom car like an asshole. It's really strange.
And the police get several notifications of the car being seen, but they're just one step behind him as the car is reported driving all about the environs of Santa Cruz, along the coast, and then into the redwoods.
Then Johnny takes the car down and parks it outside a Southern Pacific Railroad tunnel near Henry Cowell State Park.
He attempts to set the car on fire by starting a fire on the front seat, but it just smoldered and smoked, and he ran off into the forest.
At 4:45, the roaring camp train, a slow-moving switch engine which had just passed in the other direction 2 hours earlier, came through the darkness of the tunnel and smashed into Victoria Oda's Oldsmobile.
This is kind of interesting. Witnesses who had seen the car driving about erratically say there were two men and a woman in the car, and the defense would actually have them come and testify as such in court. But their descriptions are completely contradictory. And this is really something. Law enforcement actually found evidence of 3 sets of footprints leading away from the car, one of which was barefoot. They later say it was just a coincidence that those footprints happened to be there, but it is conspiracy theory gold. I say, it was ghost feet. Call the Warrens.
John Linley Frazier slunk off into the forest he loved so much. That rugged landscape of tall trees, mysterious springs, gulches, and gullies that had been hiding outlaws and desperados for over 150 years in its foggy shroud and primordial ferns. He camped in the duff of a small meadow, slowly creeping forth, moving silently through the shadows and mists for 3 days, slowly making his way back home to his mother's house like a lost little boy.
Chapter 4: The Straights versus the Longhairs. The murders obviously caused an utter panic in the little beach town. The sheriff said straight up, "We don't have any suspects, but we will be questioning hippies."
Residents blamed the long hairs that had been creeping in from out of town, transients who had no right to be here. They blamed the drugs, they blamed LSD and marijuana, they blamed the new university, they blamed that godforsaken hangout, the Catalyst, making noise into the wee hours of the night. It was the old versus the young, the hipsters versus the squares.
The police decided to go house to house looking for hippies. When they came to one empty house, they broke down the door. Turns out the house was owned by an airline pilot that was out of the country, and the county had to buy him a new door. Oops. It's like, what's that? Do you hear a drum circle? Hippies! There's hippies in there!
Oh my God, and folks started saying it was one of the communes out in the hills. And there was talk of forming vigilante gangs to go out to the hippie communities seeking justice. The Catalyst got a bomb threat. People would call and accuse them of being murderers. Someone left a note saying,
"The only good hippie is a dead hippie."
Anyone deemed a hippie was no longer allowed in the Ben Lomond grocery store. A hippie school bus was set on fire, a Molotov cocktail thrown through the window with the occupants sleeping inside. It was a miracle no one was hurt, but the bus was a loss.
But the hippies wanted nothing to do with this guy. They wanted to distance themselves as far away from him as possible. And that weird note he left behind, it struck a bell with a few of them. One of whom was Roger Crone, who worked at the Catalyst and actually lived in one of the rental units on Johnny's mom's land. So he went to Bill Tubb, who was a regular at the Catalyst, and shared an office with the public defender's private investigator. And a meeting was set up with Peter Chang, the district attorney. Roger Crone told him everything: his name, where he lived, his crazy violent rhetoric. They had their man.
In the end, it was the hippies who turned the killer in and solved the murder. As District Attorney Peter Chang would say, quote,
"The long-haired, or hippie, community was revolted by this man. The entire community was against him.
Then Sheriff Douglas James held another press conference announcing they had a suspect, John Linley Frazier.
The sheriff's office put together a surveillance team in the hills, watching the milk shack from all angles. Now, this isn't some crazy tough terrain. Gullies, huge trees, deep ravines, mountains. So what they did was they placed twigs strategically around the entrance to the shack and watched them with binoculars, checking them. Early one morning, as the sun rose, they noticed those twigs had been moved. He'd snuck back into the shack in the middle of the night. They stormed the shack to find Johnny sleeping inside, curled up like a scared little child in his sleeping bag.
An hour before high noon, the sheriff strolled onto the steps of the county building, cowboy hat perched on his head, face grim, and announced the killer had been caught and was being brought to justice.
It was Friday, October 23rd. Hours later, the funeral for the Ota family would be held.
Johnny called Dolores from the sheriff's office and told her he was sorry he'd brought disgrace on their name, and she told him she loved him.
Oh, isn't that sweet? Stand by your man. The three hippies who broke the case then issued a statement to the media.
We are all citizens of Santa Cruz County, and we are all concerned about what happened here this week and what might happen if hatred and hostility continue to grow between straights and long hairs. We recognize the irrational effect of fear these murders have brought about, and we are concerned for the safety of our entire community, straight and long hair. As it is wrong to do murder, so is it wrong for a person to take the law in his own hands. Our main concern is the crime of one man against another, regardless of who they were. It is foolishness to mistrust each other now.
Johnny's mother found the orange backpack that had been stolen from the Mooney house, and the hunting knife and a .45 pistol in her chicken shack, and turned them over to the sheriff.
In prison, Johnny was examined by a psychiatrist and told him that the term occult philosophy described his views.
Occult, by the way, simply means hidden from view. That's its literal meaning. And then he said he was ready to go to the gas chamber because his body was material and his soul was beautiful, man, and would survive on another level of existence. And he even wondered what the high would be like when the gas pellet hit the water and you went out of this world. If the lawyers wanted to defend him, that was their trip, man. But it was groovy with him.
He did say at one point that he had 3 accomplices that were part of the quote-unquote organization. But this is believed to be a fabrication, either psychosis, a red herring, or both.
But who knows? Maybe Squeaky Fromm and the Zodiac Killer were in on it and helped him commit the crime and then escaped just in the nick of time. You never know.
On January 8th, 1971, Johnny slashed his wrists and wrote "Freedom" and "Pigs" on the wall in blood. The wounds were found to be very superficial.
It was more upsetting that guards were allowing him to access a razor, almost as if encouraging him to kill himself.
The defense claimed there was too much hostility in the town of Santa Cruz itself, and the trial was moved 50 miles north to Redwood City in San Mateo County. Some people compared it to the Manson trial, and the prosecutor even conferred with Vincent Bugliosi, asking for tips. But it was nothing like the Manson trial. There weren't any supporters or groupies there for Johnny. There was no cult of devoted followers. He was just a sad, weird loner. He had a wife and mother who loved him, but even they knew he was guilty and crazy as a loon.
When his mother took the stand, he turned his back on her and refused to look at her, even though she was there in support of him. After all these years, he was still just a petulant little boy.
The jury only deliberated for 3 days before finding him guilty on each count of murder in the first degree. Then, a sanity hearing began.
On Thursday, December 2nd, 1971, he walked into the courtroom. He had shaved half his head bald. And when I say half his head, I mean his whole head, his beard, his mustache, his eyebrow, the entire side of his face and head bald. And the other side of his face and head, a long-haired, bearded hippie. It was far out, man. I mean, seriously, it is crazy looking. I remember I had a Dead Kennedys album with this weird photo collage on the record sleeve, and there was a picture of him on it with this weird smile on his face, one half hairy hippie, one half bald, but there was no context. It didn't say who he was or anything. And I would just stare at this picture and be like, what the fuck is up with this dude, man? The missing eyebrow, that really took it to a whole new level.
Yeah, I'm looking at the picture right now. It's wild. When he walked into the courtroom, he turned one way, then the other, so that all could see the bizarre new haircut, then screamed,
I call your bluff.
Again, it was noted that one of the troubling aspects of this is that he's repeatedly given a razor blade to shave with when he's already slashed his wrists once.
Prosecution had a psychiatrist come in to say that he was not insane because he only had audio hallucinations, not visual ones, which is ridiculous. One of the key elements of schizophrenia is hearing voices. Schizophrenia is practically defined by audio hallucination. The prosecution also said planning the murders proved he was sane.
But the defense said that planning things out and making elaborate plans is part of the illness. That's something paranoid schizophrenics do, sit and plan, listening to the voices in their heads.
But the jury found him sane and sentenced him to death. The foreman of the jury later said, quote, well, we knew he was insane, but we had to be sure he wouldn't ever get out again.
Of course, as many of you know, in 1977, the death penalty was repealed in California, and his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and he'd be eligible for parole, just like the Manson family. He'd never find out what that high in the gas chamber was after all.
And in February of 1972, just 2 months after the trial ended, they found the murder weapons hidden in his shack, further solidifying his guilt. But why hadn't they found them earlier? But if the cops were going to plant them, wouldn't they have done it before the trial? Unless they didn't want to be scrutinized. But if they didn't want them to be scrutinized, then why did they find them in the first place? It has to be the Zodiac killer helping them. It's the only thing that makes sense.
Chapter 5, The Aftermath.
The murder of their beloved benefactor was a devastating and terribly destructive blow to the Ota family.
Tara, the oldest of the Ota children, at 18, was living in New York and going to design school at the time of the murders, more or less on her own. Lark, who was only 16 and had been in boarding school down the highway in Monterey, was left in limbo. There was talk that maybe she could move in with her older sister Tara in New York, but at just 18, Tara didn't know if she was responsible enough to care for the younger girl. She could live with her grandmother there in Santa Cruz, in the house above the doctor's office, but she couldn't stand the thought of being there in Santa Cruz. Every landmark, every building, every site brought back such a flood of pain and memories. So she asked her best friend in Sacramento if she could live with her family, and they took her in and made her one of their own.
2 years later, Dr. Oda's mother, unable to come to grips with it all, took her own life. And in 1977, Tara, too, took her own life. The family are buried together at the Holy Cross Cemetery in Santa Cruz.
So Tara was 25 when she killed herself. So sad. John Linley Frazier eventually stopped going to his parole hearings, as it was obvious they'd never parole him. At his parole hearing in 2008, the assistant district attorney stated, "Some people deserve to be punished for the rest of their lives. John Frazier is such a man."
And 9 months later, on August 13th, 2009, John Linley Frazier hung himself in his cell in Mule Creek State Prison, Nione, California.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of John Linley Frazier, the prophet killer. But we're not done with Santa Cruz. Oh, no, we've only just begun, as these killings seemed to spark something there in the redwoods and fog. And next week, we delve deeper into the events that led this sleepy seaside town, famous for surfing and a boardwalk, into becoming known as the murder capital of the world.
Any thoughts on all this insanity?
I mean, it's just, yeah, it's really tragic. It's like, he just sucks. It's really annoying that he was like so, I mean, not that like any crazy coot murderer deserves like understanding, but like his motives don't make sense. They're in fact the opposite, with all his bullshit about like setting the environment back to, you know, square one, and yet he's going after some guy who's like so mindful and deliberate, and you know, it just makes it so much worse to me. You know, he cleaved this family in two. I mean, he should have been charged additionally for the suicide of the grandmother and the other daughter. I mean, it's just so sad and shitty, and he obviously did not even get what was deserved because he freaking killed himself.
I think he was suffering from severe mental illness. I think he was straight up crazy, schizophrenic, and it's like, I think it's a failure of our mental health system, and a failure. They call a minister. They should have fucking called it. They should have called, like, his mother finally called an ambulance, but by that time he was able to escape. You know, like, he should have been taken in and given some, like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I have like a very cynical approach on that too, because like, I mean, I worked in an inpatient psychiatric hospital for 4 years, and people diagnosed with schizophrenia today don't get the help they need. So he was not gonna, I mean, even if they had called an ambulance instead of a minister, I don't think it would have made much difference. And also, like, just to play devil's advocate a bit, there are so many people diagnosed with schizophrenia that do not have these, like, the majority of people with schizophrenia do not have like these
violent.
Exactly. Like, it's, you know, there might be kind of unsettling delusions and, you know, creepy auditory things going on. But yeah, I mean, this is just like, I don't know, wild. But yeah, it's a bummer. So what about Lark? Do we know anything about her? She's still...
Yeah, she was on a TV show called, I can't remember what it's called, but not too long ago, Mind of a Murderess. I can't remember what it is. She was on one of those, you know, television shows, and she gave a terribly tragic recount of how she was in school, and they called her out, and they said, "You got to come with us," and she had no idea what was going on. And then they put her in this car, and then they're driving, and they're like, "Your parents are dead." And she was just like, what? And it was just so insanely devastating for her and so terrible.
Oh, God.
Yeah. But she seems to be doing well, you know what I mean? And that family took her in, and they didn't want to formally adopt her because they thought that it would be... They wanted to be respectful of her parents. You know what I mean? They didn't want to be like, you do have your parents. We're not your new parents. But they did make her become her guardian, and they did raise her, and she was super happy with them, and she did have a nice life with them. And she was lucky that she had good friends like that.
Yeah, God. Oh. Well, yeah. Curious to continue the Santa Cruz story next week.
Yeah, thanks so much for listening, everybody, and thank you so much to Richard for requesting this. And if you have a request, in case you'd like us to cover, just let us know at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. We will see you next week with more of Santa Cruz, California, murder capital of the world.